Hi, my name's Joseph Roy. I'm the state of Maine the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, private lands wildlife biologist. I cover the whole state. I like to tell people if you're anywhere between Kittery or Madawaska and all other corners, I'll come see you. I grew up in Western Maine, over in the town of Jay near Farmington, and went to school to University of Maine Orono, and then kind of bounced around as a vagabond field worker for a number of years before I settled into a role as an environmental consultant in the greater Portland area, and then eventually transitioned back into working for a state agency last year. I currently live in Durham. My wife and I have a small hobby farm that requires more time than many hobbies do. And we raise a bunch of critters and have some property that we also manage for wildlife up in the Eustis area. It's kind of me in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Just wanted to remind anybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat box and then we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And up to you,
Alrighty, can
Joe.
everyone see my presentation?
Yes, I can
Okay,
see it.
perfect. Yep, so today we're going to just kind of be talking about promoting the wildlife around you. Like I said, my name's Joseph Roy, and I'm a private lands wildlife biologist. Here's my contact info. Um, I would encourage anyone anywhere who owns property and wants to talk about managing it for wildlife to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to connect you with resources I have, expand upon anything we come across today that might jog your brain and make you think about what you want to do on your land. And would definitely, depending on where you're at and what you're looking to do, could definitely also do a field visit. So I work for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, where we conserve, protect, and enhance fish and wildlife resources in the state of Maine. I am part of the Beginning with Habitat group, which focuses on helping people, municipalities, and land trusts get the data and information they need on habitat in the state of Maine to help make informed decisions. So I have a really fun little video for everyone here that may or may not play. 1 second. Gotta love technology. Well, it's not that important, so we'll skip it. All right. So before we go too far into tonight's discussion, I think it's important that we talk about what is wildlife. So wildlife is the non-domesticated animal species that occur on the landscape. And I think, everyone thinks right off the top about mammals and birds, but wildlife also includes reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. So things like mussels and insects and things of that nature. And we have a very diverse set of wildlife here in the state of Maine. We have wildlife that is occurring at the northern extent of its range and the southern part of the state, and we have some wildlife in the northern part of the state that's occurring at the southern extent of its range. And we have, a lot of different habitat types, from coastal areas, salt marshes, out onto the blueberry barrens down east, into the foothills and mountains in the west, and then all the way up north, we have a variety of habitat that provides wild space for about a little over 15,000 species that occur. So as you can see, about 15,000 of those are invertebrates, which are things we don't often think about. And 423 bird species, 61 mammal species, 39 fish, 18 amphibians, and 17 reptiles. So of the 15,000 plus species we have, we only often we think about the less than 100 species that are hunted or fished. So while we like to focus on managing for those two, I like to help people who want to manage for all species and not just the ones that we're looking at for consumption. And here in the United States, it's very interesting. We have something called the North American Model for Wildlife Conservation, which means that wildlife is held in a public trust. So while everyone in theory, owns the wildlife, It does occur on private land here in the state of Maine 94% of the time because we're such a privately owned state. So my position is designed to help that 94% of the land and the private landowners as they try to manage for habitat. And that's why I was really happy to have the opportunity today to get a chance to talk to a large group of private landowners to help provide them with the resources and the information that I have. So, what is habitat? Well, in a nutshell, it's an area that provides an organism with all the necessary requirements to survive. So, if you're thinking about yourself, you might think of things like your home, your grocery store, your garden, or your farm, or the collection of all those that provide you with your food, your water, maybe it's your well, maybe it's town water. And then you think about the way method that you use to travel to all these different places. So you might think of roads. So that kind of lines up with the four principles of habitat for wildlife. You have your food, your cover and shelter, your water, and your space. So today we're going to talk about each one of these principles in a little in depth, but I will caveat that this is definitely Wildlife Habitat 101. This is the entry level, and we could, spend literally semesters, if not careers and lives talking about just one of these components and even subcomponents of each one of these components. So we're just going to dip our feet in each one of these today, and like Terry said, if any questions, put them in the chat, and I can help answer them and connect you guys with the resources that can expand upon all this. So let's start with space. So when you're going to start managing for wildlife habitat on your property, a really important thing to think about is understanding your space and the space that's around you. It's important that you to think about this when you develop your management goals. So you think about the amount of space a species needs for food, for shelter, for reproduction, to move around, and this all varies from species to species. So when we're developing, as private landowners, developing management goals, it's important to understand the size of the space you have to manage and how that works into the home range requirements of the species you might be interested in managing for those of you who have a particular species in mind. So your home range is going to be defined as the area a species moves within its within the habitat to meet its basic needs. So when we're thinking about that, that makes it, sometimes beneficial and sometimes difficult for us as people who are looking to manage our property. It'd be difficult to manage for a desired species if you don't have the minimum space required for that species. So another thing to think about when you're thinking about space is, well, how can I increase my space? Outside of buying more property, your options are limited. Well, you can start thinking about working with your neighbors. Maybe recruiting your neighbors as you begin down this path of managing for wildlife on your property. So the cool thing we have on the Beginning with Habitat website that I think all of you might be interested in is, one second, is some tools to help you determine how much space your property is existing within. So if you look at this image on the right here, you can see there's the green areas, and then there's these really light shaded white, almost opaque areas. Well, those are showing the opaque areas are showing the areas that are developed land, and these green areas are showing the areas that are undeveloped land. So it helps you visualize if you are knowing that you're existing on, let's say, the outskirt of town. You can take a look and say, wow, I'm a part of a 840 acre undeveloped land block. So that helps you make some decisions on what you want to manage for potentially. Now that you know that you're part of a large uninterrupted habitat block, that opens up a little bit more options for you. If you're not part of an undeveloped habitat block, you can still manage to provide parts of the species life cycle. And here's another map we can use here. This also shows you the areas around you that are being conserved at this moment. So you might be able to see that you're abutting somebody who has a conservation easement, or you're abutting some large tract of land that is being managed by the state or a nonprofit or a federal agency to help provide for wildlife habitat, which is something that you can think about as you deciding how you want to manage your property, the adjacent landowners. And I should say that all of this is available on our website, and I've sent Terry a link to some resources. I was a little late getting them in, so I'm not sure if they made it out to everyone yet, but you'll be able to easily access all this by the end of this. So when we're talking about space, there's a number of species that are going to occur in habitat blocks that are what we call undeveloped over large, over 500-acre parcels. So pretty much everything likes when they have more space. And as your space decreases, some of the species that you would manage for would want to manage for kind of disappear a little bit. So once you get down to less than 500 acres, we kind of start seeing that we're starting to manage for there's a few different types of species that need more space. So you're not necessarily going to be able to manage for those as easily. And then once we get down to even less acreage, you realize if you're dealing with 20 acres or less, not as many species can live their entire life cycle in that space. Now, that's not to say that you can't effectively manage for species that require more than 20 acres. It just says that you will have a hard time managing for all of their needs. So this is where those undeveloped habitat blocks that you can look at either on aerial footage or on the beginning with habitat maps can really help you realize how much space is around you as you begin to develop. So let's say that you have deer that are using your land during a certain time of the day for bedding. Well, you might not have all of the food that they need, or you might not have all of the water that they need, but you're providing part of their day's worth of area, and you can help manage for that while knowing that the area surrounding you is managing for other things. So space is a really important consideration. I want to take another opportunity here to show you really quickly that on this series of maps that we have available for everyone to look at, we have these known occurrences of rare and significant wildlife habitat. So this is another cool tool to take a look at as you're trying to develop your management plan, because for all you might have some sort of habitat type that is of high value, and you might want to consider taking some voluntary steps towards managing for that to help retain it on the landscape or enhance it. So when it comes to managing for space, what can you do? Well, we've talked about a few things. Understand the size of your parcel, work to help keep the parcel intact by providing large areas for habitat, and work with your neighbors. So this doesn't mean that you can't do any sort of harvest activities or anything like that. It's just saying that take into consideration the size you have, the space you have, and do your best to manage to a scale that's providing for the resources that you're hoping to have on your property. The next thing that we want to talk about as a principle for habitat is food. Everything needs to eat. It's a key component of most animals' lives. The vast majority of animals spend most of their time foraging. So food is a key component for providing wildlife habitat, and by encouraging the production of diverse food options, you can help better manage for wildlife on your property. By encouraging the growth of native and varied food sources, you can meet the nutrient needs of wildlife throughout the entire season. So, when Jim's talk, he was speaking a little bit about how you see certain species starting to leaf out earlier than others. Some are starting to show their flowers. Some are starting to just have buds. And if you're a gardener, you notice that your perennials, some might bloom earlier than others. But, it's kind of like it's the same way in the natural world. So you have different food sources that are showing up during different times of the year. So by trying to do what you can to manage for all those food sources, you can provide food throughout a longer period on your property, thus retaining wildlife for a longer period of time. As we said, wildlife spends outside of the breeding season, spends most of its time foraging. So the longer you can keep them, the more options you have for food on your land, the longer you're going to keep those species on your property, and the better habitat you're going to provide for them. So there are a few types of food that we can talk about. We have mast. So mast is nuts, seeds, fruits, and berries that come from plant species. These are really nutrient rich sources of food. You know, if you think about it, we eat mast ourselves. So mast can be broken down into hard mast, which would be like your acorns and your nuts and your seeds, and then soft mast, such as berries and fruits. So an example of hard mass: acorns, beech nuts, beaked hazelnuts, and seeds. And then with your soft mass, you have apples, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, winter berries, viburnums. They all provide different types of berries. Uh, these provide really great food. So a good thing to do is when you're looking at your property, realizing what you have for species. You know, Jim just taught us all how to identify different trees. Well, we talked a lot about oaks. Oaks provide a great food source for many animals. So, doing what you can to promote acorn production by promoting those oaks on your property is a fantastic tool for managing. When you're dealing with things in your mid-story and understory, which we'll talk a little bit about later, you know, doing what you can to allow the species that produce a lot of these hard mass and soft mass species to flourish is beneficial, whether that's providing them with a little bit more light or whether that's making sure you're retaining them while you're in there doing harvest activities or things of that nature. So a lot of times, you know, to produce more, like I said, you know, we're going to be talking about maybe considering thinning around a desired crop tree that provides a lot of food, you know, getting some light in there, making sure that you're you know, you're getting rid of the invasive species around it, which we'll talk a little bit more. And then if you want to start thinking about things you might be able to do to add to those food options, you know, talk with your forester about some forest practices that might lead you to getting more of a certain type of species that is a wildlife friendly species on your property. Also, you know, walk your property. A lot of the property in the state of Maine used to be agricultural land, and we find that often you'll come across an old apple tree in the middle of the woods that used to be in a pasture. Well, by pruning that, by clearing around it, you can help get some more light in there, and you can help get the apple production to come back, and provides a lot of great food. The other thing you can consider is planting some of these species. You know, I think most of us have probably planted an apple tree in the past. You know, planting one in your back field or on the edge of your property or somewhere it can get a lot of sunlight can provide a nice food source. You know, along the road edge where you have your sumacs and stuff like that, let those grow rather than cutting them down if you don't mind them being a visual obstruction. It provides a lot of great food. So some other types of food we have are what we call our herbaceous browse. These are your grasses, your sedges, your rushes, and your agricultural crops. So as you can see, we've all seen the deer in the fields eating in the evenings or in the mornings. Providing that sort of stuff on the landscape is really beneficial. So encouraging the growth of these herbaceous plants, having diverse array of native plant species that are growing. A lot of these species have, almost all of these species in these animals have evolved together to have a relationship where they consume a variety of these different species throughout the year. So by providing that variety, we provide good forage opportunity. You know, when possible, allow your pollen bearing plants and your herbaceous species to grow as long as you can. So if you don't necessarily have to mow a field for hay or something like that, let it grow as long as you can. Let it go to seed. Those seeds are then from your grasses are going to be hit by the birds in the late fall, but they're also going to reseed and cause some good herbaceous material to come in the following year. That tender greenery that comes up in the beginning of the spring is really important to a lot of species that are coming out of their wintertime and they're hungry. Um, Another option is to think about creating some openings in your woodlot to allow some more light in, to allow these herbaceous species to kind of grow back in. And then finally, another option is a lot of people, especially some of the hunters, will like to plant wildlife friendly seed mixes on maybe old skidder landings or openings in the woods to help provide some forage throughout the fall and into the early winter weeks. Another thing we don't really think about when we think about food sources is, we're talking a little bit about those 15,000 species we have. With most of those being insects, there's a lot of species that are relying on pollen as a food source. So by promoting wildflowers on our property, we can add a lot of benefit to our wildlife species by increasing the productivity of a field that allows your insects to increase and thus allows your insect eating animals to have more forage opportunity. Um, we have a lot of really great species here in the state of Maine that are growing naturally. We have this New England aster right here. We have a lot of awesome goldenrods that provide pollen sources until the late fall. Some of the last good sources that are there for things like your bees and your other insects. And then another thing to think about where we think about where wildlife and humans overlap is a lot of us have perennial gardens where we have our flowers coming back year to year, or we have annual gardens where we put flowers in the early spring. Now, while that might not be a natural option, that still does contribute to pollen sources for wildlife on your property. And then a lot of people have clover that grows on their lawn too. On those edges, if you're not a stickler for maintaining a perfectly manicured lawn, maybe let some of that clover grow up a little bit early in the year or late in the year and allow it to go to flower to provide a little bit of extra pollen source towards the beginning and the end of the growing season. Then the other types of food we think about are insects, small mammals, aquatic foods like amphibian eggs and tadpoles and fish and mussels and clams and our wetland plants. So we've been talking a lot so far about promoting different types of food, herbaceous material that also then creates good forage opportunities for insects that are utilizing pollen. Well, that just creates good forage opportunities for things like our insect-eating birds. We have a number of them, our phoebes, even our kestrels. We have a number of flycatcher species. So the more we're providing for them, we're providing more biomass in terms of insects. We're now also providing it more in terms of food for larger species to consume, and then that just continues to work its way up the food chain. So we want to create habitat that encourages this insect production and this small mammal habitat production. That's things like these openings I've talked a little bit about in the forest, which we'll go over a little bit more later. Leaving down some wood and brush piles after you've cleared up around your yard, pile it in the woods, and those little brush piles provide a lot of great opportunity for insects to occur and small mammals to occur. And then we'll talk a little bit later too about the opportunities you have to leaving some trees that have fallen on your property, leaving behind standing dead trees, retaining your leaf litter. For me, I always retain my fall leaf litter until the following spring. It provides great opportunities for grubs and earthworms and insects, and a lot of migrating songbirds will land on my lawn and get the last few good bites they get before they head to their breeding grounds, or some of the first good few bites of eat that they get on their way back. And then when it comes to your aquatic food sources, the big thing is just to make sure that you're maintaining clean water resources. You're not filling in your wetlands and your ponds. You have good erosion control, proper stream crossings, things of that nature to help keep that water quality high and help provide more and more options for food. You'll have more productive stream or pond, let's say, and you'll get more mussels or clams, and you'll have more small mammal activity. You'll have more potential for otters and things of that nature. And then finally, we can also put out your bird feeders. Now, one thing we always say we want people to consider with bird feeders, and there's a link to this in the handout that I sent Terry this afternoon. Just keep in mind the proper guidance for avoiding human and animal conflict. We do get complaints and issues every multiple times a year of bears or raccoons or things like that getting into people's bird feeders. So it's just something to keep in mind. And if you're going to put out a bird feeder, make sure you do your best to maintain it all year. A lot of birds will get used to that food source being there and kind of key in on it and get a little thrown off if the the gravy train stops, so to say. So what can we do? We've talked about a lot of things here. We can maintain current food sources, promote the natural production of hard and soft mass species, maintain open spaces and herbaceous areas to provide forage opportunities and increase production of pollinators and insects, promote these wildflowers and even pollinator gardens. I think on the edge of my vegetable garden, I plant some wildflower seeds, native wildflower seed mix that really helps promote the pollinators along the edge of my garden, which behooves my garden as well. And plant natural food sources, whether we're talking about apples or the Maine Audubon does a native plant sale. A lot of the soil and water conservation districts do a native plant sales. Picking up some of those viburnums like your maple leaf viburnum or your wild raisin and things like that that help produce more soft mass species and are things that get eaten a lot. Also things like winterberry. You see a lot of that on the edges of your wetlands. Retain that the best you can. So the next component of habitat that I want to talk about is cover. It's beneficial from a wildlife habitat perspective to maintain a forest with diverse age structure. Wildlife will often use different parts of a forest throughout their life cycle. For example, wood frogs need vernal pools for breeding and egg laying, but actually spend 98% of their lives in the surrounding forested wetlands and upland forest. So by providing a diverse age structure, you can provide a number of different type of habitats for a diverse array of species. So now I'm not a forester, so if these aren't the numbers that a forester would use to describe the overstory, the midstory, and the understory, I apologize to any forester who is paying attention, but this is some information that we utilize when talking about the overstory, midstory, and understory from a wildlife perspective. So your forest canopy is something that I think everyone's familiar with. It's your tall trees, your 30 feet plus tall trees. These are the oldest, really some of the older trees on your landscape. They're your big trees. Um, you know, Oftentimes here in the southern part of the state, this mostly dominated by pines and oaks. That changes as you move north. These maintaining a healthy overstory is really important from a wildlife perspective because you're providing ample perching opportunities for birds of prey or insect eating birds that hang out up there waiting to see some critters fly by. You're providing nesting opportunities. A variety of species nest in the canopy of trees. And then a variety of species key in on these large trees that are standing dead. And this is where you're going to get a lot of that hard mass production from your oaks coming out of the understory and your beech nuts and things of that nature. So maintaining an overstory is important for wildlife and for providing what we would, which is a little different than what the foresters would call seed trees, but what we call seed trees, providing for food. And then maintaining standing dead trees in this overstory is really important because, as I noted, there's a number of bird species that rely on cavities that occur in standing dead trees for their nesting. A lot of times, these cavities are first made by things like pileated woodpeckers, which are feeding. So as a tree dies and it's standing, if it's not in danger of falling on you or your home or someplace that needs to be protected, consider leaving those behind, and it provides a lot of really great nesting resources and a lot of great food resources as well. So then the mid-story, these are what we're calling the trees from 6 to 30 feet tall. And, again, some species of birds, for example, key in on this size tree for their nesting priorities. This also contributes to some of the hard mass and soft mass forage opportunities in the forest. And this is going to be the next generation of overstory trees that you have. The other thing about the mid-story is being lower to the ground. Now there's more browsing opportunities for some of the taller species like our moose and our deer. They can reach, quite a bit of this tree and really key in a lot on the food that it provides. And even in this mid-story, it's important to, maintain uh, a good number of standing dead trees. As I said earlier, the pileated woodpeckers like really large standing dead trees, but when you start thinking about some of your other woodpecker species like hairy woodpeckers or downy woodpeckers or yellow-bellied sapsuckers, they start keying in on smaller size standing dead trees. So by maintaining, a good strong overstory and maintaining a good midstory, you're providing, checking the box for a lot of different habitat types there when dealing with cover. And then the understory. So this is 0 to 6 feet tall. This is everything on the ground. This consists of your shrubs and your small trees and your saplings. So this provides a lot of nesting habitat for a variety of species, but it also provides a lot of protection for these species. So when you have things like your quaking aspen that are really thick and young, deer find themselves feeling a lot safer in there because there's a visual obstruction from them and predators. So it provides a lot of cover for these species in terms of their day-to-day activity in their bedding habitat. And also in here, I want to talk a little bit about downed wood or coarse woody material. So this is the kind of stuff like your sticks and your branches and your leaf litter and things of that nature that are going to be on the ground in this layer. As a wildlife biologist, we really encourage retaining as much of that as you can because it provides cover for small mammals and amphibians. Brush piles help out your medium-sized carnivores. They might den in there, or they might use it as an ambush location for while they're waiting for other small mammals to walk by for hunting. So these provide a lot of great aspects of wildlife habitat. And then the leaf litter and the forest debris provide cover for your amphibians. I think we all probably have memories of when we're younger rolling over a log to pull out a spotted salamander or a frog or something like that, in my case, so I could, throw it onto one of my brothers. But, it does provide habitat and it's really important for everything that feeds upon those things. So as I said, creating these brush piles, this one's out in an open field here or on the edge of a habitat type, but creating these also within the forest are really great. Growing up cutting firewood, a lot of times we'd limb our trees out there and we just pile them up in the woods and leave it behind, and then that's a good place to start poking around for snowshoe hare later in the year. And then standing dead trees, I'll sound like a broken record by the end of this. They provide some really great habitat. You have a lot of cavity nesting birds that are going to need these standing dead trees to provide them with their nesting habitat. I'm thinking of things like wood ducks, for example. Also, we have birds like chickadees and titmice that are cavity nesters. Now, that's a little bit smaller cavity, but maintaining these standing dead trees, it's really important for providing that key component, that cover that some species can only get from this resource. So what can we do? Well, like we said, we maintain a diverse age structure. That's something you might want to talk with about a forester on your property when they come to your property. Retaining standing dead trees where it's safe. Retaining forest debris like twigs, sticks, and leaf litter. And like I said, delaying lawn maintenance is the excuse I use with my wife every year that I shouldn't have to mow or rake the leaves because I'm providing wildlife habitat through the end of the fall and into the early spring. And then creating brush piles, that delayed mowing, it all does a lot of great stuff. And then for the woodworkers amongst us, building some bird, bat, and pollinator boxes to increase nesting and roosting opportunities. There's some great guidance out there on our website about that. It's important that you're maintaining these, but it's also important that these don't turn into kind of a pet project where you go and you stick your head in the wood duck box every day because you want to see a baby wood duck. But the other thing you can do is when you're in an area that you have a lot of this bird activity, rather than building the wood duck boxes or building these cavities for the animals, consider girdling some trees where it's safe. They'll die. It might take a few years for a pileated to come in and create that cavity, but you're now creating a permanent natural fixture that provides that essential cover that those species need. So the next thing I want to talk about is water. Um, Water is an essential for all wildlife, not only for species that drink it, but for the species that live within it. Wildlife rely on water for hydration, thermoregulation, hygiene, food sources, habitat, and travel. Water occurs on the landscape in a variety of forms. We're going to talk about those in a minute. And protecting your water resources and using best management practices around them is really going to be an essential component of your wildlife management plan. So Maine is a wet state. I can tell you this as a former wetland delineator. There's water everywhere. We have lakes, ponds, rivers and streams, bays and oceans, coastal wetlands and salt marshes, freshwater wetlands and vernal pools. Think everyone thinks of that trout hole that they went to or that river that they've paddled, and brings back great memories, and think about that on the landscape and what you can provide for water habitat. So on our website, we have this really great riparian habitat tool. So riparian habitat is defined as the area around a water resource. So whether that's a stream or a pond or a river, that riparian habitat is really essential for wildlife in most cases. Something like 90% of wildlife species will utilize riparian habitat at some point in its life cycle. As towns and cities develop, the area around streams and rivers is often the last area to remain undeveloped, and it kind of provides to animals what our roads and streams and highways, our roads and streets and highways provide to us, these vital travel corridors to move around. So we have this great mapping tool online that can show you all the riparian habitat in your town or on your parcel if you have any. And this is depicted by a 75-foot or 250-foot buffer on the map to just kind of show you this is an area we would consider high value from a wildlife habitat perspective. So other thing I want to talk about briefly is a temporary pool source, a water source, which we call vernal pools. Some of you may be familiar with them. Some of you may not. Uh, Vernal pools have what we call a temporary hydro period, meaning that it does not hold water for the entire season, entire year, just for part of the season. They're small, they're forested, and they're fishless, and they provide breeding habitat for amphibians. So this is an example of a vernal pool in May and the same exact location in August. So as you can see, there's a lot of water here, and in that arrow there is pointed to a downed tree within that water that's providing a ton of habitat space and cover within a water resource for amphibians. And not only does this provide amphibian breeding habitat, it provides a great opportunity for animals to start, drinking some water in the interior of the forest, not necessarily having to congregate to some of the other water resources that they're limited to during the rest of the year. And also, this amphibian habitat here leads to amphibians breeding, which provides forage opportunity for things like your turtles and other species to key in on tadpoles and things of that nature. So what can we do to maintain the water on our property? Well, determine the water resources you have on site. You can utilize tools like that stream habitat viewer that I showed you a few minutes ago. You can also walk your property and get an idea of what you have for streams and rivers and ponds. And then think about what else you might have. Those vernal pools, that area that might look like a puddle to you, but you notice is there every year and dries out in the early summer or the midsummer. And then as part of your management plan, make sure you're doing what you can to protect those resources. So make sure that you're keeping a nice riparian buffer if you're looking to manage for wildlife habitat. Um, talk with your forester and let them know that these are important resources to you, and you want to make sure you are mitigating permanent impacts during any sort of harvest you have planned. The other thing we want to make sure is that we have connectivity. So you don't want your streams to be blocked up, and that can be, an undersized culvert or a perched culvert that is above the water level, so nothing can move upstream. Things can only move downstream. Clogged culverts or erosion filling in a pool that you have along your pond, or garbage or debris in your wetlands or your water resources. So we want to make sure we don't have that kind of stuff. And then, like I said, maintain a healthy vegetated buffer around these resources as long as it is part of your goal for managing for wildlife. So those are the 4 components of wildlife habitat that you want to consider when working on developing a management plan. Now, kind of the evil bonus category I put in here, and we all as wildlife managers and foresters wish we didn't have to, is invasive species. So we touched about this a little bit in Jim's talk. I don't talk a ton about pests, but I will take a quick minute to talk about vegetation. So this is a purple loosestrife plant here, and unfortunately, people find it to be quite beautiful, and that's kind of what's caused it to propagate so much on the landscape. So an invasive species is a non-native species uh, whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So the term invasive is used for the most aggressive non-native species. So these species, like Jim said earlier, is they grow rapidly, and they can spread with or without human help. They cause major disturbances in areas where they're present. Talking about the invasive species leafing out sooner, or growing faster, or flowering more vibrantly, getting more attention. They're not palatable, so animals don't eat them, so they have the opportunity to overtake. So invasive species are really bad when it comes to trying to manage your property. So think of things like certain honeysuckle species are invasive, and they produce these you would think are beautiful red berries, just like your winter berry. Well, they're not as consumed as much by our bird species. They don't provide the same amount of nutrients. So think of it as, if we're just always eating potato chips and never eating any vegetables or whole meals, we're not getting the benefit from that food source. But when bird species are eating these, they're spreading these seeds, and these seeds are starting to propagate. So invasive species end up taking over the niche or the place in the environment that a certain species would actually exist, something that's native, and it ends up outcompeting it and removing it from the landscape, thus decreasing the productivity of that piece of habitat. And these invasive species are introduced so quickly, whether it's through, illegal introduction, accidental introduction. We live in a very global world, and things can come across the other side of the world very quickly and then take root here. And then we're dealing with issues with species from Europe or Southeast Asia or Africa, and nothing here evolved with it. So it has the opportunity to outcompete before anything else can catch up. So what can we do about invasive species? Well, learn about the different invasive species there are. Some really common ones are things like your Phragmites and your purple loosestrife. And then survey your property, or have your property surveyed for invasive species. I always point out invasive species when I see them on walk and talks that I'm doing. I've noticed every forester I've been on a walk and talk with has done their best to also point out these invasive species. So it's something to note if you have. And then on our website, we have a variety of resources that can help you deal with your invasive species that you have present. Sometimes it's options using herbicide. Sometimes it's options just using non-herbicide methods. And a quick note on that. So I find often that when I'm talking with people about managing their property for wildlife, if they have invasive species, some people are reluctant to explore herbicide options for the removal. So, I recently read Silent Spring that kind of started this whole discussion about the use of different pesticides and whatnot. And, the book was written in the 1960s, and a lot has changed when it comes to herbicides since then. So we don't have these broad applications in the same way that they did back then. We have much more targeted applications. There's a much more robust health and safety policy. So when you think about utilizing herbicide for the removal of invasive species, it's not always this big, scary, bad thing that it used to be. And it definitely has so much value for wildlife habitat to remove the non-native species that are there. And it's a tool that I do encourage people to take a minute to consider if it's applicable for their property. The other thing you can do is contact your soil and water conservation district. They may have resources available to help you manage this issue. And then from there, you can work with them or a professional to develop an invasive species management plan and move on to removing the invasive species. And finally, what's our last thing we can do when managing for wildlife on our property? Look at options to make it sustainable. So learn about Maine's current land use tax programs, things like tree growth, things like open space, and look into different conservation options. If that's something you're interested in, talk to your local land trust. Might be something they can help you with. You certainly don't have to put a conservation easement or anything of that nature on your property, but for some people, it might be something that they are interested in doing. So, with that being said, I tend to ramble, so I'll stop. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, Joe, we do have a couple of questions. One is how to balance wildlife habitat management with hunting or recreation, which happens either in the woods or in the water.
Yeah, 1 second here. Turn my camera on. Yeah, so wildlife habitat management and hunting often and have for a very long time kind of run hand in hand. So the great professionals we have here at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife exhaustively research and learn what they need to make management recommendations to figure out what is an acceptable level of harvest. And now, assuming that laws aren't being broken, that fits in perfectly with the wildlife management practices that we're seeing on the landscape and trying to encourage. And the big thing is when it comes to recreation is we just want to make sure that the recreation activities aren't negatively impacting the resources. So that's where it becomes really important is to making sure you're staying on marked trails or you're building proper stream crossings on things like four-wheeler trails and things like that. Respecting the water resources, not refueling close to the water with your four-wheelers and things of that nature, and limiting that impact.
Okay, and then another question that we have is, would wildlife habitat conservation be written into a timber management plan? And I'll kind of answer that. A lot of it depends on what the goal of the landowner is. Most foresters do mention wildlife habitat conservation because we are very interested in it. But unless someone has that as their focus, we probably wouldn't go into a whole lot of depth with it.
Yeah, I've noticed that, Terry, depending on the forester I've worked with and depending on the client, some people that it, like you said, can be a major component of their management objectives. And, they can say to their forester, how can I manage my forest to increase hard mast and soft mast or increase, dense cover for deer bedding and things of that nature. But if you don't vocalize that to the professional you're working with, they might not know to ask if you want to include it to that detail. And then there's a happy medium. There's definitely forest management plans definitely provide wildlife habitat management practices when done responsibly in working with your forester that can definitely tell the whole story for you. There's a lot of foresters on this call that have a lot more experience than I do working with these landowners and helping write that into the management plans. So it's been done for a very long time and definitely fits right in nicely when you vocalize it to the professionals.
Okay, we have someone, Bill, did you have a question? You've got your hand up.
Yes, please. Can you hear me, Joe?
Yes, I can.
Joe, you're assuming that all wildlife is desirable wildlife, but for those of us who live in the woods, there's plenty, including black flies, ticks, mosquitoes, and so forth, that's hardly desirable. And
Yes.
To that, you can add the turkeys, which spread the invasive species seeds. And the deer also are all over the place, at least around me. And then you add in the red squirrels and the woodchucks and the porcupines. And yes, there are particularly wild songbirds that are desirable, but so much of what we find in the woods, most of us off in the woods would just as soon not see.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question there is, Bill, but I definitely hear what you're saying.
Well, I think the question is, what does one do to limit these undesirable species that are in the woods? And turkeys are certainly one excellent example of them. I mean, they're just hordes of them sweeping through and spreading the invasive species. You can't plant anything in the garden, as with deer, because they go straight for them.
Yeah, I think it's important when you're looking at what you would consider a nuisance wildlife interaction, and the step one is always to understand what's bringing the animal to your area. So, like you use the example of your garden. So this gets a little bit more micro than more of a micro discussion than habitat management as a whole, but doing things to remove those attractants or exclude them from being available to the wildlife is the first step that you can take. And as for like turkeys and things like that, spreading the seeds of invasive species, so really highlights the importance of making sure we're doing our best to remove those invasives on the landscape through other methodologies. So if it's not there to be consumed and spread, it helps slow the increase of the inundation of that. And then, unfortunately, there's a lot of species that are naturally occurring, that have been naturally occurring in large numbers for the state, and they're not always desirable. And I would just encourage you to work with any sort of animal damage professional or things like that to help figure out a way to mitigate any sort of negative impact that's occurring on your property.
Thank you.
No problem. See, are there any species that the state is wanting to track that we could report sightings of? There are a few different initiatives if you go on the state's website. Things like certain at-risk bird species and things like that you can report sightings through some online mapping tools. So, perfect example would be eBird. That's a really good citizen science tool that was developed, I think, by Cornell University a while back, and it has been that platform has been adopted by the state to do some saltbird marshland bird surveys. And the other thing is by utilizing technology like that, some of the professionals look at those what we would call citizen science data, and utilize that in decision making. or to learn more or recognize trends. There are also some state level, state designed citizen science initiatives that have to do with bird and wildlife species within the riparian zone on our website. If you were to just go in the search bar, put in citizen science. I don't want to say the exact title of them because I'm sure I'll mess them up and my colleagues will scold me for not plugging their projects appropriately. But I would definitely encourage you to take a look on the website and find those citizen science things. And I will look for myself and send an email to Terry when I do find them, and hopefully we can get that info back out to everybody. Well, I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I'm quite verbose, so I can go on forever. So if there's anything else, I put my contact info up at the beginning of this, and I would encourage everyone on the call with any sort of questions to shoot me an email. If I can't answer the question, I will connect you with someone in your region who can, or someone at another level who can help you out. And I'd love to come take a look at some properties with people. And I know that the district foresters are hearing from me every day, almost asking them to come look at habitat all the time. So